Thanks for joining us for Magic in the Room. Before we start today's episode, I want to make sure you know about our latest online course called Guest Service. In this self-paced online learning course, you will learn 5 simple steps to ensure an outstanding customer experience and how to ensure people feel seen, heard, and understood. Check out the course at www.purposeandperformancegroup.com/online-learning or find the link in the show notes.
Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Luke Freeman.
And I'm Hannah Braderud, and today we're excited to have a recurring guest and team member, Ben West, with us as our guest in the studio. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks. Yeah, glad to be here. You know, normally I'm like sitting in a chair on the other side of the camera, so being here is a little different, but thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and for you who are listening or watching, Ben West is our producer of our podcast. So we're really grateful to have Ben as part of our team. It's what is helping this podcast evolve and become better as we're all learning. We're going through the process of learning how to do a podcast well. And as a team, we've been going through all the different stages of group development. So that's a little spoiler alert. That's our episode. What we're going to talk about today is Bruce Tuckman's theory of the stages of group development. Now, we like to talk about team development. And so before we really get into the theory and the different stages and how to apply them, why don't we talk a little bit about group versus team and what is really a team? Luke, you want to take that on?
Sure. Yeah. And as we get into this theory of the different stages, I think Tuckman would say they apply to any group, and I would agree. But specifically, we're going to be talking about teams. We're not going to be talking about an incoming freshman class at a high school, right? That's a group that is going to go through some different stages as they get to know one another and develop, right? We're talking about teams. And for the purposes of the work that we do, we define a team as a group of people who have, most importantly, shared goals or a shared objective. They're working together for a common cause, for a common purpose to get something done. The second thing that makes a group a team instead of just a group is that they're interdependent with one another. So if you take 5 people that each never have to talk to each other, they're each building one component of a machine. So someone's building a gear and the other person's building a chain and the other person's building a frame, and they can do all that work and then hand it off to someone that puts it all together. That's probably not a team if they don't have to be interdependent and have some level of collaboration. So interdependence is the second. The third is who's on the team and who's not on the team. So there's clear members and clear non-members. So this one gets a little tricky. When you think about an organization, you can think about a large organization as a team, but it gets a little bit muddy whenever you zoom out that far and aren't just talking about a specific team doing a specific part of the work, where they truly are collaborating on an interpersonal level at some sort of cadence. And that's the fourth thing, is that there are some clear time boundaries to the team. So if you think about a little league sports team, right, there's a clear start date when they become a team and an end date after the final championship tournament or whatever, when they're probably not a team anymore. For most work teams, there is some sort of definable starting, stopping for the team. It might be a project that they're working on. It might be a certain deliverable. It might just be, hey, whenever someone leaves or we reorg, right, that's the beginning or end point for a team. So most people aren't on the same team for 20 years anymore.
Right.
So when we say team versus group, that's what we mean, is that they have shared goals. There's some interdependence between members. We know who's on the team and who's not on the team. And there's some sort of clear time component to it. And that could include their cadences, weekly, monthly, whatever their cadences are, to connect with one another.
Okay. So a team would go through the stages of group development, just like any group. So let's start by kind of talking through maybe a high level of the model and what are the stages?
Yeah. So I love this theory of the stages of group development because it's super sticky. It's one of those things so Bruce Tuckman published his first paper on this in 1965. He was a professor at Ohio State University. And it has just become like very present in popular consciousness. It's kind of like something like emotional intelligence,
right?
It's become kind of part of the normal speak, at least in corporate America. People refer to stages of group development. And I'd say the majority of middle managers have at least heard it and have some sort of understanding about it. I know the military uses stages of group development to some degree and talks through it. And so it's just a very widely known and understood model. But as Tuckman first published it, it has 4 steps. And so I'll just walk through them kind of maybe one at a time, and we can discuss each of the steps. But they're forming, storming, norming, and performing are the 4 stages that he lays out. So let's kind of talk through them one at a time. So the first is the forming stage. And I like to, anytime I'm talking about stages of group development, imagine like a middle schooler, right? The most socially aware population of people on the planet that are just like, they walk into the first day of middle school and it's just like, who are these other people? Where do I stand in relation to them? What's the power structure? How is every teacher in every class going to create a different power structure and culture on those teams, right? They are just hyper aware. When I say this, how do people react? When I make this facial expression, how do people react? When I wear this, who else is wearing that similar thing? So it's like that's the mindset of forming. It's coming in, it's being curious, but also a little bit defensive, if that's the right word, not in a negative way, but in a, who am I? How do I fit? I want to be intentional about how I position myself here. So what do you guys think? I mean, experiences with forming teams, what are some hallmarks that you've seen?
Yeah, Ben, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that word defensiveness kind of stood out to me because I was just thinking about like some teams that I've been part of that are forming. And I think a lot of it depends on like the context that the team gets formed out of. Like I'm thinking about when I came onto this team, for example, like I didn't feel any particular defensiveness, definitely like some, how do I fit, that kind of thing. But like by and large, it came out of a context of like already knowing Luke really well, kind of having some experiences. So like that forming experience was completely different from another forming experience that I have in mind where basically I like ended up being drafted into a leadership of an organization that had a lot of problems. And like coming in, I knew that we were going to have to make some hard decisions that were going to make people angry, make people leave. Like I knew it was going to be a bad thing. And like that forming experience was completely different, a lot more defensiveness, like for better or for worse, selfishly or unselfishly, like all of those things. It just like, it's different. And so, yeah, I was just reflecting as you were saying that how the reason for that team being formed has a big impact on how you come into that forming experience. And maybe that's something to be aware of, like if you're going into a new team, like know that context and then kind of ignore it, right? That might be a little strong, maybe not ignore it, be aware of it and respond to it in a way that is healthy. Once you understand it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about too, there's the forming stage when a team forms kind of from scratch, but in your experiences also when you're brought into a team.
Yeah.
And then there's the more indirect, when there's leadership change maybe outside of that team, but it impacts the team dynamic very directly because of that new leader's. It's not the leader of the team, but it's the leader of the leader.
Yeah.
And how that could trigger a team to have to reform because now there's new expectations or different communication and new ways of interacting, and everybody's having to figure out once again, how do I fit in? And we're going through another forming experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm really excited in the second half of this when we get to talk about, how does a leader intentionally engage with navigating a group through the stages of group development? And then just in the environment we're in right now, like so many groups getting kicked back to forming stage because of an environmental factor, turnover in the group, restructure, whatever it is, right? So lots of groups getting kind of pushed back into forming or storming phases. So speaking of storming, that's the second phase. And storming is typically described as a period of time when the personalities in the group are negotiating for their position, right? Figuring out the power dynamics, and not just interpersonal dynamics, but also positioning on why are we here? There's a narrative forming about what's most important and what's the culture of this group.
Yeah.
And so, take something as simple as a brand position, right? So if I'm creating a new product and I'm going to design it, I have to decide, do I want this to really show up to the market as being a very functional product that people are going to buy because it works really well, or as a product with mostly an emotional benefit? So it comes with a certain status, or it enables participation in a subgroup of culture, or whatever that is, right? So I'm going to have to decide in creating that product, like, what's most important. And if I don't decide what's most important, I'm going to end up with some sort of mishmash of design that is not going to perform well. And teams are the same way. Teams have to decide what's most important, what is our shared objective, and if we have more than one, which most teams do, which one's the most important and which one are we going to let go whenever we get into hard decisions. Typically that storming happens during some of those first really difficult decisions that need to be made, like a deadline's coming up, or people are collaborating and realize that personalities are not gelling. You add into the mix people not assuming positive intent from one another, like all of the healthy team stuff, right? And that storming phase can either be relatively painless, or it can be long, extended, and very painful.
Yeah, this is where often a lot of conflict will arise in this stage, because you haven't maybe been together in this team configuration long enough to really establish that trust. And I think it's true for any even new relationship that, even between two people, there's those stages that you go through where, you're all coming together and everything might seem great or it might be defensive, but then inevitably there's going to be this sort of fall from grace kind of period and experience where, okay, now we're seeing what people are really made of. And that's often the phrase that I hear. And it's often used in the sense of, oh, you're not really who we thought you were.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we're all that way. It's when we get triggered and we are not feeling safe, or we feel psychologically threatened in some way, we start to feel like we have to fight for our position or our status or our relationships. And that's when you start to see these other sides that can give rise to sometimes personal conflict on teams.
Yeah. Ben, any experiences stand out for you with storming teams?
No, I think the only thing that I was kind of thinking about on this stage is like, this is one where kind of that like poppiness of this, like that lots of people know about it, is helpful because you get to name it. And so their understanding might not be as deep as Luke's or whatever, but you can at least say, hey, like, here's a thing that's going on. We can name it. And now that we've named it, we can talk about it. And so, yeah, just kind of thinking back to some of my experiences, like that was a really important thing, is just to say, all right, hard stop. Let's talk about this for a second. Here's what's going on here. Now we can start dealing with this in more constructive ways, because we're not just kind of running around without direction.
Yeah. And I mean, that's another reason this is so sticky. If you go back and listen to the Hope Theory episode with John Hellman, he talks about, hope is only possible when there are pathways, tactical on some level pathways of what we need to do to move forward. And I think this model provides that, right?
Yeah.
It names it. Oh, I think we're storming right now. This is kind of painful. But also, hey, most groups move from storming into norming and then into performing. So if I Google stages of group development, I can go read that for 10 minutes and know, okay, well, maybe I could do these 3 things to help us move into the norming phase. Right? It gives that pathway, which I think provides hope for people. So let's move on to norming. So this is where basically the rules of the group become clear. So you've gone through the storming phase. Norming is like, okay, there's some role clarity and there's some purpose clarity that's been established through the storming phase. And like, I don't want to be too dramatic about this, because you can move through a few of these stages in one meeting.
Right.
Like, it's not always this long, drawn out, painful thing. It depends on number of people in the group. Have they worked together before? How strong is the centralized culture of the organization that they're drawing from? Like, there might be very prescribed ways for a group to move through this, where you could sit down and say, what's our most important objective? Okay, let's create a document for this project that spells out each of our roles, right? So there's some tools that you might have to have some conversation. Well, like, okay, you're the project manager. Does that mean that you are booking all travel? Well, no, I would like people to book their own travel. Okay, well, I don't know. On a project I was on before, the project manager like took care of all those logistics. And no, like, I don't have time to do that because I have to do these 3 other things. That's storming happening right there. But then you've already moved, because you have a plan out of that. Everyone's agreed. And really the next couple weeks or month of the project can just be a norming phase where people test out those roles and the clarity you've created. And everyone a month later doesn't even really think about it. It all becomes kind of that tacit understanding of how this group works together.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, right? So we talk about, okay, we can have many cycles of this happening even within a single meeting or on a smaller project, or it can be this longer term team development for a long-standing team, right? Where you might have very slow cycles of this happening. And so being able to recognize them, and then also, do they all happen in the same order all the time?
Yeah, I think no.
Yeah.
Personally. And I think it depends on the leader, right? So and not just the leader, if you have a really experienced team, or just like people who are nice to each other.
Right.
Or maybe the task is not very complicated.
Yeah.
I see, and I would maybe even argue with Tuckman. I would love to, maybe we need to try and have him on if he's still alive. I think maybe he is. I would love to have this debate on like, should it be storming norming or norming storming? Because I feel like I see just as often this scenario where there's forming and then a pretty drawn out norming period where some level of performance is happening.
Yeah.
And then the storming, is more of like an acute, things pop up, are dealt with. And then you go back to kind of that normed phase, and then they pop up again. And once enough things have popped up that you really have the right role clarity, you really have experimented with how you're going to operate as a team, then you find yourself moving into that last step, which is performing.
Right. So, Ben, what, in your experience or opinion, what do you think? Is it storming norming or norming storming?
I guess I kind of see it as some levels. It's kind of like, no matter what, when you walk into a room, you're going to do some of those storming things, even if it's just kind of you, like reading the room, doing those, middle school things. Like, so no matter what. So I think the way that I kind of think of it is like you do it once at one level, then you do some norming for a while, and then you do some more storming because you kind of worked some things out, but there's some other things that are coming in. You're starting to understand some new dynamics as you get to know each other. So maybe it's levels or cycles, something like that. But I think it's pretty hard to just say like you're going to go from one to the next all the way through. It feels really linear.
Yeah, it
the
does.
reality of a messy world.
So does that mean that we can't perform until we've gone through all of these, Luke?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I've definitely been part of or facilitated teams where it's like, for whatever reason, like they performed well just right off the bat. But I think they still had done a little bit of that, even if it was unconscious, that kind of storming level. But yeah, I think you can perform while you're storming.
Yeah. And I will say, and this isn't a tried and true, the rule, right? I'm sure there are exceptions, but the more linear the task is and the more experienced the team members are, or maybe even one or two critical team members that have leadership ability, the faster folks move to performance. And it's kind of the facilitator's, nightmare when you get a team that's like, yeah, this is the first day we've all been together. And you're like, okay, well, I've got this experiential activity that we're going to talk about what went well and what didn't go well. You have all these plans. This thing usually takes groups like an hour and a half, and they're done in 20 minutes and they like aced it. You're like, okay, well, good thing I brought backup stuff to do, like, hey, what was your key to success? Well, our key to success is we're just really smart and good, right? And they don't say that, but it's true, right? Some folks just like are great. Like it's just meant to succeed.
And they have an innate ability to read each other and pull together as a team kind of right off the bat. And yeah, it does make the facilitator role a little obsolete. It's like, okay, well, you didn't need me because you already had, but that's the goal, right? To get to self-managed teams that can take themselves straight into performing.
Yeah.
Before you kind of go through performing, I wanted to mention one other thing on norming, and this is kind of from some experiences also. I think, you were talking about how roles become clear, but I think that there's also this interplay between storming and norming, which is about negotiating either explicitly or behind the scenes and no one realizes that they are, but negotiating purpose essentially, or mission, vision, like whatever words you want to give it for that team or that organization. And I mean, there's like a huge obstacle there. If that's not well understood, like, I don't know that you're ever going to get through all of these stages if you haven't done that work.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many limiting factors on team performance at so many different levels. And I think one of them is purpose clarity. One of them is the emotional intelligence of the least mature person on the team, right? At some point, if you have a immature person or someone with low EQ, like the team will be held back to their level. So like there's all these other factors too, like environmental factors, whatever. But, I hear what you're saying about have we negotiated why we're here. I was on a team where the purpose of the team was to continue existing.
Wow.
And it was not an unhealthy team. Like whatever you want to call that, self-maintenance, perpetuation. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Self-perpetuation was enough of a shared goal for that team to do some hard work around, get to know each other well around, get role clarity around, and just keep moving forward. Now, I would argue a better purpose would lead them into some storming and lead to higher levels of performance on some measures, right? But if all you're measuring is continuity, then they performed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I wouldn't it's hard to put value judgments on like, okay, a team can move through these stages and reach performance. Well, they might reach performance at something that's not super inspiring or not super, positive even in some ways. I mean, German army in World War II, like high performance team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like there were units that did amazing things from a team performance perspective. Like, does that mean, does the fact that they were doing horrible things, right? And I'm just using this because it's the most obvious example from history, but you could plug in thousands of other examples. Like, does that mean that they didn't go through these stages and reach performance? Like, I don't think so.
Right.
I think based on their goals and their roles and their purpose, like they reached high performance.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then just, and obviously the goal here is to get to performance, the performing stage. And that's really what we want to talk about. We've had this ongoing conversation about the Great Resignation and what is happening right now, where so many people have either left their jobs or are actively thinking about leaving their jobs or actively seeking new opportunities. And, so what impact does that have on teams and on organizations? So we want to talk about that. Just one other thing on norming, which we've been talking about. I think an important part is that operationalizing the purpose and the values and getting really clear on this is how we do business here. This is the norm. And, we've talked about meaningful employment and meaningful work, right? When we get to that phase that this is the norm, right? This feels really meaningful. And when we're constantly disrupted because of high turnover and a lot of people leaving and moving industries and moving geographies, and, there's a lot of disruption happening right now, we get constantly pulled back into the forming stage. So we do want to talk a little bit about are there anything in particular we want to talk about performing, Luke, before we get to kind of the tactics for leaders?
Yeah. I mean, just to define what it is, I mean, it's the team performing at its highest potential.
Yeah.
And, we've talked about this idea of flow on the podcast before. The idea of flow is that the challenge we're facing is the right level challenge that it pulls out the best of us.
Yeah.
So it's like that person that loses track of time because they're like, what they're working on is so engaging. They're just pulled into the best version of themselves. And I think you can apply that to this idea of performance in stages of group development, where the team has gotten rid of everything, that's holding them back from reaching that best version of themselves as it relates to the goal that they're working on.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I would add is that Tuckman's model doesn't include a closing, what we call adjourning or adjourning, so it will rhyme. But a lot of folks have added on that stage to stages of group development. And I do think it's critical to keep that in mind. I think it's a good addition to the model because, as if Chris Province was here with us, he would say, the way that people leave your presence defines how they're going to remember you.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing goes for teams. And if you can be a part of creating a narrative of what we accomplished, what it means, what we learned and can apply to future things, there's huge value to that and provides a closure to people that they need to be able to move forward and engage in a healthy way on other teams. Yeah. And, Ben, earlier you were sharing this idea about a team you were on that didn't have good closure and kind of the psychological, I don't want to overuse trauma, but like distress that it kind of left people in as they wrestled with what did that experience mean? I mean, do you mind sharing a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that this particular example was, an organization that lots of people were involved in on lots of different levels. It wasn't employment necessarily. Some people were employed by the organization. Some people were just members of it. And so it ended. And I think for me, it ending was a good thing. I think that was the right and the courageous decision. But then I think what ends up happening after that is, and some of this is just me and some of it's what I'm observing kind of in other people that were part of it, is now we all have to go back and wrestle with like, okay, like what did it mean that I gave years of my life to this thing? And for some people, it's like their whole life to this thing.
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean that it ended? What does it mean that maybe some people weren't who I thought that they were? Like, what does that mean? What does it mean that, you know, in this case, like, what does it mean that all of these things, including COVID, like kind of, I don't know, came together? And it's easy to say, well, if COVID hadn't, or if this hadn't, or that hadn't. So yeah, it's just like this process now of trying to understand, like, what do I learn from that? What do I take forward from it? Does that mean it was wasted? And I have no like conclusion for like what people should do with that, except that like, I think you have to wrestle with it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure that some people don't and aren't, but I think that if you don't, then partly you don't learn from it. Like that's part of it. Like the learning is in the reflection. We know that. But I think also like you're just left empty, you know, like you don't really know, like, and it's just kind of like, well, I guess I just walk away from that thing. So, you know, in this case, it's a big thing. For a lot of people, it's a really big thing. For me, it was a medium-sized thing. For some people, it's a small thing. You know, in a team that's just together for a day, like you don't have to do quite that much reflection about it, but still like you have to give it some meaning, some understanding of what you learn from it, what you take forward.
Yeah. All right. So with that, let's take a quick break and go to a question of the day. And then we'll come back and talk about how to apply this and some tangible tactics that leaders can use as we lead our teams through all this change.
All right, so for today's question of the day, I thought I'd bring another resource that we can just kind of share with our audience. This is something that I've been using a couple times in the last few engagements that we've done, and then Bob has been also. So this is the At My Best cards, and these are, you know, available online, easy to find. And it's just a card. So on one side is words, patient, generous, rigorous, one word on each side. And then on the other side is just a picture. And the picture is kind of loosely related to the word. It's not kind of like a direct correlation, but there's a picture on each side, on the other side of each of them. So these cards, there's lots of different ways you can use them, but they're just a way to give people some creativity around the words that they pick when they're doing an activity. So one way that you might use it is you just put them all out on the table, have everybody stand around, and maybe before a workshop, and you ask them, okay, what word do you want to describe how you show up to this workshop? It's kind of a way to get them to do a little bit of commitment. And so they may pick, you know, I want to show up brave. That's the one that I happen to see. So I want to show up brave today. Or you could do the pictures, pick a picture that kind of is a metaphor for how you want to show up. Another way you can use them is just to have people use them to do recognition for each other. So I could pick up, you know, warm or whatever and say, Hannah, you're a warm person. When you did this, you showed up with that characteristic. So there's lots of ways you can use it. I think that what's great about them is that it forces people to think about words that they wouldn't have thought about anyway. Like if I say to you, Luke, or you, Hannah, I'm like, so when you're at your best, what's your superpower? Like you probably have kind of like a few things that just automatically come to mind. But when you put these all out on the table, it kind of forces you to expand your imagination a little bit about what can apply to me or what can apply to this other person. So
I love this. And I really like these cards. You know, another way that we've used them is in demonstrating meaningful recognition by picking a word for someone, kind of like you did for me, and talk about something specific that they did and how this quality or characteristic showed up.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So it's a great tool for sure. And yeah, we use it quite a bit. I don't know, Luke, have you used it? What's some applications you've done?
Yeah, quite a bit. I tend to use the images more, surprise, surprise. And so I'll oftentimes find myself asking, like, you know, what's a image that represents one of the pivotal moments in your life or in your career, or what image represents a time that you felt like you were at your best. And so we kind of use it to get people into story mode, or what represents the role that you feel like you're most valuable for the team. So there's like a bike mechanic in there. I remember that because I've picked it before, the guy working on a bike. I'm like, man, I just want to, for this team, make sure that all the pieces and, everyone who's coming together as a different part of the team has the oil that they need and are in the right role and positioned to correctly move this team forward as effectively and efficiently as possible. So things like that, are conversations that come up. And this is one of my favorite tools to use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of what I love about it is it can be used for lots of different things. Yeah. Similar to the, other cards, like there's always lots of different applications for it. So I thought today we just do like a really quick little version of it for our question of the day. I didn't put all the cards out, just there's not enough room, but, why don't we do, so from these, just pick something that's maybe something that you would like to be working towards, like something that you see as a valuable characteristic, but that maybe you don't always show up with as well as you could. So we'll pick one and just kind of explain it a little bit and see what we can learn about each other from it. And if you don't see anything there and you the deck and you want to pick something out, you can, because I just kind of randomly picked a few. So.
All right. So are we doing this with each other? Are we picking cards?
No, pick for yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, pick for yourself.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah. So for me, it's pretty easy. If I look at the things on here that I'm like, yes, I need to focus on that for a while. Warm is the thing that pops out to me. I can be kind of cool, calm, collected, calculating. And with it's so strange for me with a group. I feel like I can come across as warm. When I'm with an individual leader, sometimes it takes me a little bit longer. And I think it is because I do care so much about connection at a deep level. It can be hard for me to be warm at kind of like that surface level instead of just jumping right into like, what's your biggest goal? And how do we talk about how the strategy to get there, which is helpful, but oftentimes I have a hard time making those conversations happen because I'm not good at like, well, what did you and your kids do this last weekend? Because I don't innately care about that. I care about how do we help you change the world, And it's a blind spot for me oftentimes, and something that I need to work on, just that interpersonal warmth.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, yeah, I don't perceive you as very warm, Luke. No, I'm kidding. I think once you know you, right, then you definitely experience the warmth. But I'm kind of with you in, out of all these words, and if you're listening, there's a lot of different words here, and I connect with pretty much all of them on some level where I'm like, yeah, this is either how I perceive myself to be, or at least what I'm trying to be, how I'm trying to show up. Brave, open-minded. I'm skipping over rigorous because I can be in certain ways, but other ways, like I don't like a lot of rigor. I like more looseness.
Yeah.
Generous, patient, empathetic. Empathetic is one that I wanted to pull out because I think this is one that I focus a lot on, both for myself and in training that I do with people. Like, what is empathy and how do we show empathy in action? And there's these three levels of empathy, right? There's the cognitive empathy, which I think I'm pretty good at, where it's like I can intellectually put myself into your shoes and, imagine, like I can think my way through how it must be to be you, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the emotional empathy, which some people have a very strong emotional empathy, almost to the point where it becomes debilitating because you feel so strongly what someone else feels, right? And that's the piece that I find myself having to kind of be intentional about and really connect with, right? What is the feeling and the emotion, and how can I, feel with you, right? Instead of immediately when somebody's sharing a challenge or struggle, I go to the solution and try to help them fix it right away.
Yeah.
And that's where I think taking a moment to pause and really express that. And how do we do that? is by really kind of mirroring back to people what they say. And when they tell us how they feel, that we take a moment rather than dismiss the feeling and say, oh, but you don't have to worry about that. Or, to stop and say, I feel you. That must be a really challenging spot to be in. I can see how that must feel really hard. And then we can start to work on solution, right? And that's the third level of empathy, is the helpful empathy, which is really, okay, I can understand how you feel. I can feel how you feel, but I'm also motivated to help you. And that's really what we call compassionate empathy, where I see your struggle, I feel your struggle. I don't get sucked into your struggle. I can still be here. I can connect with you and help you get through it.
Yeah.
What about you, Ben?
Thanks, Hannah. Oh, for me. So I had one that I was going to pick at first, but then I kind of switched just as I was thinking about this. And so this one's, it's a little bit kind of personal and vulnerable a little bit, but so I'm going to pick this one, wise. And the reason is because I think that this has a little bit to do with age. But for whatever reason, like I'm a person who people often come to, and they see me as a safe person to have a conversation. And I've had people like say, I appreciate like the wisdom that you offered me. And so like, I have a hard time embracing that though, because this is a word like wise has like a lot of weight and a lot of responsibility to it. And so I think just, as we get older, as I get older, as, you accumulate that life learning, that kind of thing, like kind of, I think it's a question I'm asking myself, like, am I willing to embrace that role of being like the wise one, whatever that means. I don't know what that really means, but and with my kids, just kind of all around, like, it was a word that when I saw it, I was like, I don't want to touch that one. But the more I thought about it, like there's something there that needs to be analyzed in me and probably for all of us in our roles as people that coach, that people come to for advice, like all of that kind of thing. Like, how does wisdom, not just knowledge, kind of play into that? So that one's the one that I picked. Got a little Ben West insight there. So, which is why we do this.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I love this tool. Thanks for bringing it to the table, Ben.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And for listeners, we'll put a link in the show notes where to find it, but they're called the At My Best cards, and they're easy to find online. And they have a great guide online of other like variations, ways that you can do it. There's a lot of different ways that you can use it.
Yeah.
So
and we've said this before, but just having this tool in your bag that you carry around with you makes meaningful connection with teams, groups, or even someone that you're coaching a lot easier, right? You can kind of autopilot it and say, hey, I've got this tool. I don't have to be a genius coach facilitator that has all of these, questions top of mind. So I love that it makes our jobs easier.
Yeah, right. And I think it's a great tool for leaders and team members, coaches. Even I think we could use it with friends too, to get to know each other on a little different level or show appreciation.
Yep, absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks for letting me share this with you, and we'll get back to the episode.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed our question of the day today. Let's get back to our topic. We've been talking about stages of team development, really based on Bruce Tuckman's theory of the stages of group development. So in this environment that we find ourselves in, with the great resignation happening all over, we've alluded to this a few times, right? This is a very relevant topic because with so much disruption, we constantly get catapulted back into forming and storming. And how do we keep teams performing at a high level with all this constant change going on?
Yeah, and I think there's a huge change in mindset, whereas a lot of folks who have engaged with this model over the last, since 1965, I think saw the storming phase as kind of this necessary suffering to get to performing and just like something to, live through that. But inevitably, right, we have hope that we're going to get to some of the other stages. Whereas now, like, I think very little hope exists that you're not going to be engaging in storming at some point with a team that you're on that has had to reform or is trying to move really fast or get stood up to, respond to something that's emerging in the market. Like, we're going to be engaged in some of those uncomfortable stages of group development, pretty regularly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just kind of thinking about, there's this book, Managing Transitions by Bridges, and their idea of the neutral zone, and how it feels like part of this is like, we're going to end up in the neutral zone for a long time sometimes. Mm-hmm. But like, the thing that's great about it is like the way that he approaches it, that they approach it, is that the neutral zone is like where new ideas come. It's where like you start getting strong. And so I think if we can find a way to embrace that this is not so linear, it's something that we're going to have to kind of do all together all the time, then we can find some ways to see positive in it, Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I was just thinking about is like, let's be willing to go back to basics. Like,
Right.
We may feel like we just had the role clarity conversation yesterday, but let's have it today again, because we're adding this new person. Like, let's keep going back to basics, purpose, like all of those things, and not think that we just sort of like did them, we're done with them, now we can perform. Like, we're going to have to keep doing them and be persistent in that.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable, just having that mindset, right? That just because we did it once doesn't mean that we're there, that we're staying in that clarity. So constantly bringing it back to clarity. Clarity is kindness. We've been hearing that a few times lately, and I think that's really true, right? It helps to facilitate team performance.
Yeah, I mean, and in the old world, the primary thing we were managing was performance, right? So, we had this linear thing that we could plan on. And so we built this whole garage of tools around performance management, financial tools and strategy tools and all this stuff to say, okay, groups is a little painful to stand up a new team, right? But eventually we're going to get to this place where we're just going to have these dials and levers and tools that we can apply to maximize performance. And then we have this little closet over here, this broom closet. And we have a few tools we've added over the years around, well, what do we do during forming and storming of teams? Yeah. Well, now it's like we need a garage full of tools that every leader can go to manage forming and storming, kind of the things you're talking about, like role clarity exercises and purpose clarity, all of those things. And like, you could probably reduce some performance management stuff down to the broom closet and say like, okay, we've changed, right? That's a win. We're all still here. That's a win. All right, now we're going to have to iterate again. And we're going to reshuffle the cards and stand up new teams to be able to react to what's going and be intentional in where we want to take our customers, where we want to take our team members. So there is this kind of shift in how leaders spend their time and the resources that they need to be able to manage different stages of teams.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing, Luke, is, we've been talking about, what we're talking about is change, a lot of change that's happening very quickly. Mm-hmm. And, we had this kind of discussion earlier before we were recording about, what is change management? We've done a couple of different episodes on change management on this podcast. And you were talking about in the legacy world, all we were managing was performance. Well, what if the new way to look at it is that all management is change management, and we're just managing through change? And that's what these stages are. There's constant change and constant disruption on a team, and we have to manage through the change and go through those stages and continue to have the conversations, continue to surface the healthy conflict that can get everything out on the table so we can get back to performing or continue to perform through all the change.
Yeah.
All right. So as we kind of wrap up today, Luke, what are some key tactical leadership behaviors that we can use at each of these stages?
Yeah, so I'm going to move fast here in the interest of time, but just some really tactical things. So in forming, be clear about the ground rules. Just like anyone who walks into that middle school we talked about earlier, they know what's within bounds and what's without. Now, when they get to the classroom, each teacher is going to have different preferences, right? Our teams have to be the same way. They need clear ground rules and figure out what can this team design themselves and how they approach work and what's out of bounds. And this is where a lot of leaders fail because they want to be empowering and hands-off, and they don't provide enough direct leadership around why are we here, what's within scope, what's without of scope for this team. So that's forming. The more clear we are, the faster folks are going to move through that. For storming, it's being super comfortable with healthy conflict, encouraging conflict. Some people call it mining for conflict, looking for those expressions people give, looking for the words people say that are code speak for I'm not happy or I disagree, calling those out. And then really remembering that relational conflict does not move us to performance. But if we assume positive intent, we've done the necessary trust building, that we can have task conflict on how we're going to get things done. What should our priorities be? How are we going to get from point A to point B? Like voices can be raised, people can be passionate, as long as it's not this interpersonal conflict about people's character, right? So leaders have to be super comfortable with that. All right, for norming, like we can't take our foot off the gas, okay? Let's keep moving back to storming whenever we need to. Let's not just be happy with norming. Although sometimes it's okay. Like you need to, as the leader, really marry the level of challenge that is brought to the team with their level of competence. So if they're going to find that flow state, you can't flood the channel and just give them so much that they're in this state of anxiety. You also can't hold back too much and let them just stay in comfort zone for too long, or people are going to find themselves demotivated. And then when we get to performance, like let's just celebrate. Let's take notes of lessons learned. Let's make sure that whatever is working now, we're communicating out and case studying out to other teams across the organization to make sure that we can kind of capture any magic in the bottle as soon as possible. And then for adjourning, we talked about it a little bit, but like make meaning. Don't let it end with a question mark. What did we learn? What went well? What didn't go well? Hold a retrospective for every project. Socialize what the findings were. Like make it very clear what was accomplished and what we learned about the project itself, but also how we approach the project. So those are just some very specific behaviors that I think if every leader took some time to think through, what can I do this week that would help my team move forward, whether it's around conflict, whether it's around role or purpose clarity, or closing really well, I think that you would see some pretty quick benefit on your teams.
Awesome. All right. So as we are adjourning this episode of the podcast, Ben, any final thoughts, observations?
Yeah, I think what's kind of sticking with me is when we think about the Great Resignation and we think about just the accelerating pace of change, like we've been talking about that for a long time, COVID or no COVID,
Yeah.
This just kind of accelerates the accelerated change. Like, I think that closing stage becomes more important. Mm-hmm. And because people are going to be going through that constantly. So whether it's like people figuring out their own personal practice for that, like I think that that's part of it, but also just teams being intentional. Like, hey, this person's moving on. Like, let's make sure that we celebrate the success that they had here, send them off well, like all of those kinds of things. Like, I don't know, as it just becomes a constant thing that's going on, let's constantly close well and make sure that we leave people healthy as they're moving in and out of all these different situations.
I love that, Ben. What a great note to close on. So if you're listening to our show and you want some help in taking, managing through all this change with your teams, look us up. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. And we would love to engage with you and your team in meaningful conversation and moving into performance and staying in a high-performing environment. So thank you both for being here today. Really great conversation.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bretterow, and Luke Freeman. and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love available on Apple Music. And this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.